I thought the hardest part of my wedding night was going to be the zipper on the back of my dress. 47 tiny pearl buttons that had taken my best friend Sophie 40 minutes to fasten, and which I suspected would take even longer to undo. I had absolutely no idea that the hardest part would be sprinting through a fire exit in my wedding gown with $10,000 in cash stuffed down the front of my corset, my father-in-law's terrified whisper still ringing in my ears, "Take the money, run now, they're already in the house." I didn't know who they were in that moment. I didn't stop to ask, because the look on Robert Hale's face, the face of a quiet, gentle man who had barely said 2 consecutive sentences to me in the 18 months I'd known him, was the face of someone who had already calculated exactly what would happen to me if I stayed. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wet. He pressed the envelope into my hands with the trembling urgency of a man unburdening his conscience at the very last possible second, and something deep and ancient in me, some animal instinct that civilized life had nearly buried under layers of trust and love and willful blindness, understood that I needed to believe him. I ran. I didn't look back. What I discovered over the weeks that followed, about my husband, about his family, about the careful and patient trap that had been set for me, was worse than anything my imagination had conjured while I sprinted down that stairwell in my grandmother's pearl earrings. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up running for my life on what was supposed to be the most beautiful night of my life, you need to understand how it all began. You need to understand who I was before Daniel Hale smiled at me across a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning in October, and how quickly, how completely, how willingly I let myself become someone else. My grandmother's house smelled like lavender and old paperbacks. That is the first thing I always noticed when I came home to it. That particular combination of the sachets she kept in every drawer and closet and the towers of novels she had accumulated over 7 decades of devoted reading. Edith Callaway had lived in that house for 51 years. She had raised my mother there, had tended the garden there through 4 decades of changing seasons, had sat on the back porch every evening until her knees made it too difficult, watching the fireflies come up in the long grass at the edge of the property. When she died in March of the year I turned 27, she left the house to me. Not to my mother, not to my aunt, to me, to Emma Callaway, her only granddaughter, who had driven out every other Sunday for as long as I could remember, and sat with her in that kitchen drinking tea so strong it left a tannin film on your teeth, listening to her talk about books and weather and the small dignified dramas of her neighborhood. She left me the house, the 1/4 acre of land it sat on, the contents of her modest savings account, and a handwritten note that said simply, "This is yours, Emma. Don't let anyone take it from you." I had read that note 100 times in the months after she died. I had held it while I sat in the kitchen alone and let the silence of the house settle around me. I had pressed the paper smooth against the old pine table and read those 12 words over and over, thinking about what she meant, feeling the weight of the gift she had given me. Not just the property, which an appraiser valued at just over $300,000, but the stability, the rootedness, the sense of having a place in the world that was truly mine. I was a kindergarten teacher, earning a modest salary in a city where rent consumed most of what I made. That house was the most valuable thing I had ever owned. It was the most valuable thing I had ever been given. I understood, in the way you understand things when grief is still raw and immediate, that it was also a responsibility, a trust. I moved in 6 weeks after the funeral. I kept her lavender sachets and most of her books. I painted the kitchen a warm yellow that she would have approved of, and I planted sweet peas along the back fence because she had always wanted to and never quite gotten around to it. I lived there alone, and it was quiet and good, and for the first several months I was simply grateful for the house, for the memory of her, for the feeling of solidity beneath my feet. I met Daniel at the coffee shop on Aldrich Street on a Tuesday in October, 8 months after I moved in. He was sitting 2 tables away with a laptop and a look of mild frustration that I recognized immediately as the face of someone whose Wi-Fi had just disconnected at an inconvenient moment. I had the same look. I said something about the notoriously unreliable router, and he laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that catches you off guard, genuine and unguarded, and warmer than you expect from a stranger. We talked for 20 minutes. He was a civil engineer, he said, working on a municipal infrastructure project nearby. He had a careful, quiet way of speaking that I found immediately appealing after years of dating men who talked over everything you said. He looked at me directly when I spoke. He remembered what I said and referred back to it later in the conversation. He was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's straight nose. And he asked for my number with a directness that was more reassuring than aggressive. We dated for 4 months before he brought me home to meet his family. I had asked about them before then, casually in the way you do when you are figuring someone out, and the answers had been somewhat vague. His mother, Patricia, was a force of nature, he said, and smiled in a way I interpreted as affectionate. His father, Robert, was quiet and kept to himself. He had a brother, Marcus, who lived in Seattle and whom he was not particularly close to. There was an uncle, his mother's brother, Victor, who came around occasionally and whom Daniel described with a slightly tighter expression as complicated. I filed these details away without dwelling on them. Every family had its complicated members. Every family had its force of nature mother. It didn't seem unusual. The dinner where I met Patricia Hale was held at her home, a large, aggressively decorated house in an older suburb 40 minutes from the city. I remember the smell of it when I walked in. Heavy floral perfume layered over something sharper underneath, like bleach or ammonia, as though the surface had been cleaned very recently and very thoroughly. Patricia was waiting in the hallway in a cream blouse and a string of pearls that were almost certainly real, with a smile that was wide and immediately professionally warm. She was in her early 60s, trim and upright, with hair that had been colored to a particular shade of honeyed blonde that required significant maintenance and significant money. She took my hands in both of hers and squeezed them and said how long she had waited to meet me. She had heard so many wonderful things. Wasn't I just lovely? Robert was in the kitchen. He emerged holding a dish towel with the slightly apologetic demeanor of a man who has learned to occupy the margins of his own home. And he shook my hand and said hello. And that was, essentially, the sum of his engagement with me that evening. He was a lean, gray-haired man in his mid-60s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors and the quiet eyes of someone who had spent even more time listening. He sat at his end of the table and ate his dinner and occasionally made a brief, careful observation that Patricia talked over without breaking stride. Patricia's dinner was excellent. Her conversation was relentless. She asked me about my teaching, warmly, interestedly, with the practiced attention of someone who has learned that asking questions is the most efficient way to gather information while appearing to give. She asked about my neighborhood, my commute, my family. When I mentioned, almost in passing, that I had recently inherited my grandmother's home, something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. It was there and gone in less than a second. A sharpening, a focusing, like a lens clicking into place. And then the warmth was back, and she was saying how lovely, how meaningful to be connected to family that way, to have roots. I noticed it. I tucked it away somewhere in the back of my mind, and then, because she laughed at something Daniel said, and the conversation moved on, and the wine was good, and the evening was pleasant, I let it drift. I wish I hadn't. I wish I had sat with that flicker a little longer. We got engaged 14 months after we met. Daniel proposed in the kitchen of my grandmother's house, my house, over a dinner I had cooked, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother on his father's side, which I found deeply moving. He had thought carefully about it. He had chosen the place and the ring with what felt like genuine intentionality. And when I said yes, and he hugged me and the ring fit perfectly on my finger, I felt the specific happiness of someone who believes they have chosen well. I called Sophie, and she screamed with joy. I called my mother, and she cried. I sent a photograph of the ring to my aunt, who sent back 3 exclamation points and a row of heart emojis. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen after Daniel fell asleep and looked at the ring in the lamplight and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely at peace. The engagement period lasted 11 months. They were, in retrospect, months in which I was kept very busy and very distracted by the enormous machinery of planning a wedding, which is precisely the kind of all-consuming enterprise that makes it very easy not to notice other things. There were venue decisions and caterers and flower consultations and dress fittings and seating charts and all the rest of it, and Patricia was deeply enthusiastically involved in all of it. She had opinions about everything. She expressed these opinions with the confidence of someone accustomed to having them acted upon, and while I pushed back on some of them, the wedding colors, the menu, the timing of the ceremony, I conceded on others simply because I lacked the energy to argue and because I told myself over and over that she was just excited, that this was what mothers of the groom did, that her enthusiasm, however exhausting, came from a place of genuine investment in her son's happiness. It was during the engagement that Patricia's questions about the house began. They were gradual and scattered, inserted casually into other conversations, so that they never felt like a pattern until much later, when I had reason to look back and connect them. She asked once, over lunch, whether I had updated the insurance on the property since moving in. She asked another time, at a dress fitting, what I planned to do about the property taxes given my teacher's salary. Had I thought about that? She asked, twice in 3 months, whether I had considered getting a proper estate attorney to look over the ownership documents, since inheritances could sometimes be complicated, and it was always better to be sure. Each time I answered honestly and without alarm, and each time she listened with the focused attentiveness of someone taking notes. And each time I told myself afterward that she was just being practical, that she was demonstrating the kind of financial pragmatism that came with age and experience. There were other things I noticed and told myself were nothing. Daniel, who had always been somewhat close with his mother, began taking phone calls from her in another room. Not every time, but more often than before. When I came into the kitchen once and found him on the phone, hunching slightly over the counter in a way that read as private, he saw me and straightened immediately, and his expression did something complicated before settling back into neutral. And he said, "Mom, I've got to go," and hung up, and I asked who it was, and he said his mother, and I said, "Is everything okay?" And he said, "Yes, totally fine. She was just asking about the rehearsal dinner." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. It is easier than you think to choose belief over instinct when you love someone and have spent 14 months building a life with them and 4 months planning a wedding, and when the alternative, that something is wrong, genuinely wrong, not just the ordinary friction of 2 families merging, is too large and too destabilizing to fully contemplate. Victor appeared for the first time at our engagement party 6 months before the wedding. He was Patricia's younger brother, 3 years younger, so in his late 50s, with a large physical presence and a smile that worked very hard to convey friendliness without quite achieving warmth. He was well dressed in an expensive, slightly aggressive way, a jacket that was a shade too sharp, a watch that was meant to be noticed. He shook my hand at the party and said he had heard a lot about me, which was what everyone says, except that the way he said it, with a particular kind of evaluative attention, as though he were assessing rather than greeting, made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle very faintly. He talked with Patricia for a long time in a corner of the room while the rest of the party went on around them. I saw them together from across the room, 2 people who were not socializing but conferring. At one point, Patricia touched Victor's arm and said something quiet, and he nodded and glanced in my direction. And even from 15 feet away, I felt it like a physical thing, being looked at as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. I told Sophie about it the next day over coffee, and she said he sounded unpleasant and asked if Daniel knew him well, and I said not really, that they weren't close. And Sophie said, well, every family has a Victor, and I agreed. And we talked about something else, and 3 weeks passed, and I was busy with the caterer, and I let it go. I let so many things go. The wedding itself was on a Saturday in September. The venue was a converted farmhouse 40 minutes from the city. My choice, one of the few things I had insisted on and held firm about. I had wanted somewhere that felt real rather than constructed. Somewhere with old wooden beams and imperfect plaster walls and windows that let in the actual outdoors, and I had gotten it. Sophie zipped me into my dress at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and stood back with her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes filling up, and I looked in the mirror and felt the particular, slightly surreal emotion of recognizing yourself and not recognizing yourself at the same time. The dress was ivory silk with a simple cut, and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and I thought, standing there in the golden September light that came through the old windows, that she would have approved. I thought about her note, "Don't let anyone take it from you." I pressed her earring between my fingers and felt the small, smooth weight of it and thought, I won't. I'm building something now, something permanent. I walked down the aisle toward Daniel on my father's arm, and Daniel's face when he saw me was everything you hope for. Unguarded and overwhelmed, his eyes bright in a way that made the air go out of my chest in the best possible way. We said our vows in front of 80 people, most of whom were genuinely happy to be there. Patricia sat in the front row in a dove-gray dress and cried in a way that I found, in the moment, touching. Robert sat beside her with a stillness that I had come to associate with him, that particular brand of contained quiet that I had always read as introversion or mild depression, or simply the long, habituated silence of a man married to a very loud woman. I registered, very briefly, that his expression was not the expression of a happy father watching his son get married. It was the expression of someone enduring something. But it was a fleeting observation, gone almost as quickly as it came, swallowed by the ceremony and the music and the fact that my own father was squeezing my hand and trying not to cry. Victor was seated in the 4th row with 2 men I did not recognize. I noticed them because I had memorized the seating chart and they were not on it. When I mentioned it quietly to Daniel during the cocktail hour, he looked briefly over his shoulder and then looked back at me and said they were probably friends of Victor's who'd come along last minute. It was fine. His tone was light, but his jaw was tight, and he reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray with a speed that suggested he would prefer not to continue the conversation. The reception was beautiful. The food was perfect. Sophie gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made half the room cry. My father danced with me to a song he had chosen weeks earlier in secret, and then told me over my shoulder, his voice rough, that he was proud of me and that my grandmother was proud of me. And I held on to him a moment longer than the dance required because I needed to. I danced with Daniel and felt in those minutes the unassailable rightness of the whole thing, the choice, the day, the person. I thought, whatever complications lie ahead, whatever adjustments and negotiations the years require, this is worth it. He is worth it. I did not see Robert for most of the evening. He was present in the background of photographs and presumably present at the tables, but he had that quality that some people have of occupying space without asserting it, of being there without quite registering. At some point during the later hours of the reception, when the dancing had given way to the soft conversational drift that comes at the end of wedding receptions, I noticed that he was watching me from across the room with an expression I could not immediately name. Not warmly, not coldly. Something more troubled than either. The look of a man trying to make a decision and finding it unbearable either way. I smiled at him across the room. He did not smile back. He looked down at his hands. At 11:15, Daniel and I said our goodnights. The hotel was attached to the venue, a 5-minute walk through a corridor that had been decorated with string lights for the occasion. We were staying in the bridal suite on the 3rd floor, a large room with a 4-poster bed and French doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the garden. I had seen photographs of it online when booking and had thought it was beautiful. I was thinking about those photographs, the warm light, the white linens, the flowers, As Daniel and I walked down the corridor with our hands linked and the last notes of the music fading behind us, I was thinking about none of the right things. Daniel said he needed to stop briefly at the front desk to confirm the breakfast time for the morning. It was such a small, ordinary thing that I didn't question it at all. I said I'd go ahead and he could meet me upstairs, and he kissed me in the corridor and handed me the key card and smiled the smile that I had fallen in love with, and I took the elevator up alone. The bridal suite was at the end of a hallway. I walked toward it in my wedding dress, heels in hand, the carpet soft under my bare feet, and I was perhaps 10 feet from the door when I heard it open. Not from inside, I had not yet used the key card, but from within the room itself, as though someone were already there. The door opened inward about 8 inches, and Robert Hale appeared in the gap, fully dressed, his face ashen, his eyes doing something I had never seen them do before. They were urgent, alive, afraid. He looked up and down the hallway quickly, the way you do when you are checking for witnesses rather than guests. Then he looked at me and said very quietly, barely above a breath, "Emma, come in. Close the door." I stepped inside. The room was lit only by the bedside lamp. Robert closed the door behind me and turned the deadbolt, and then stood with his back against it as though his body were the last line of a defense, and he was not sure it was sufficient. I remember the texture of that moment very precisely. The smell of roses from the arrangements on the dresser, the quiet hum of the climate control, the distant sound of the reception still going below us, muffled by distance and walls and the terrible new weight of the air in that room. "Robert," I said, "what?" He reached inside his jacket. His hand was shaking. He pulled out a thick manila envelope, the kind that holds documents, or, as I discovered when he pressed it into my hands, $10,000 in banded cash, $50 bills, bound in groups that I could feel the bulk of through the paper. He pressed the envelope against my chest and held it there with both hands and looked at me with those wet, urgent eyes and said the words that I have heard in my sleep every night since. "Take the money. Change out of that dress. There's a bag in the bathroom. I put clothes in there for you. Take the fire exit at the end of the hall. Don't go back through the lobby. Call someone you trust and have them meet you outside, away from the building. Don't tell Daniel. Don't call a hotel phone. Use your mobile." He paused. His throat worked. "They're already in the house, Emma. They came up the back stairs 20 minutes ago. You can't be here when Daniel brings them up." I stared at him. My hands had closed around the envelope without my consciously deciding to close them. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat, which had gone very dry and tight, and the champagne I had drunk 2 hours earlier was suddenly nauseating, a warmth in my stomach that had gone sour and wrong. "Who?" I said. My voice was someone else's voice, flat and careful and removed. "Who is in the house?" Robert's jaw worked. He looked away and then back. "Victor, and 2 men who work for him, and—" He stopped. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were resolute in the way that a person's eyes become when they have decided to stop protecting themselves. "And my son. Emma, my son knows they're here. He's bringing you up to them." The world did not drop away dramatically. It did not tilt or spin. What happened was something quieter and more terrible than that. Everything simply rearranged itself. Every memory I had of the past 18 months shifted half a degree, and in that shift, things that had looked one way now looked another way, and I could not immediately breathe. "The bag," Robert said, "in the bathroom. Go now, Emma, please. I'm asking you to trust me. I know I have not given you much reason to, but I am asking anyway. Please go." I went. The bag in the bathroom was a dark canvas tote bag, not mine, placed there by Robert at some point earlier that evening. Inside was a pair of jeans, a gray sweatshirt, a pair of canvas sneakers in my size, and a folded piece of paper with Sophie's name on the outside. I don't know how he knew her shoe size was the same as mine. I don't know when he had time to do any of it. I stood in the bathroom in my wedding dress for approximately 30 seconds with the tote bag in my hands and a sound in my ears like the ocean, that hollow blood pressure roar that the body produces when it is deciding between fight and flight. and then I reached behind me for the 47 pearl buttons that Sophie had spent 40 minutes fastening, and I started undoing them. My fingers were shaking badly. I thought about nothing. Or rather, I thought about one thing: the door at the end of the hallway, and how many steps it would take to reach it. I was out of the dress in 4 minutes. I rolled it carefully. I don't know why, some deep habituated instinct about treating fine things gently, and set it on the edge of the bath. I put on the jeans and the sweatshirt and the sneakers, stuffed the envelope of money into the sweatshirt's front pocket, and picked up my phone and my clutch bag from the counter. I paused with my hand on the bathroom door handle. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not who I had been at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Something had shifted in her face. Something had hardened around the eyes and loosened around the mouth, and she looked like someone who was no longer being entirely surprised by what she had found, as though some part of her had been waiting, quietly and without acknowledgement, for exactly this. I went back into the bedroom. Robert was still standing at the door. We looked at each other. "The paper in the bag," I said. "What is it?" "An address," he said. "A storage unit. There are copies of documents there that you will need. I have been keeping them for 3 months." He swallowed hard. "I should have come to you sooner. He stopped. "I was afraid of my own family, which is not an excuse. I know that." "Tell me one thing," I said. "Just one. What do they want?" Robert looked at me with the particular grief of a man who has been complicit in something he cannot undo and knows it. "Your house," he said simply. "Patricia has wanted that house since the day you told her about it. The whole thing, the relationship, the engagement, the wedding. It was supposed to end tonight with you signing a transfer of ownership. Under duress. Victor was going to make sure you had no choice." He paused. "There is already a document with your signature on it, a power of attorney, forged. Victor has a man who does that work. They were going to use it and the one you signed tonight to start the transfer process Monday morning." I stood very still. I thought about my grandmother's note. "Don't let anyone take it from you." "Go," said Robert, "please." I went. The fire exit door was heavy and cold under my hands, and it opened onto a metal staircase that descended the side of the building in the dark September air. I went down it in my canvas sneakers with the September cold on my face and the cash pressing against my ribs and the wedding earrings still in my ears. I'd forgotten to take them out. And the distant sound of music from the reception below, people who had no idea, still dancing. I reached the ground and stood for a moment against the wall of the building, breathing. My phone had 12% battery. I called Sophie. She answered on the second ring, still at the reception, laughing at something someone had just said. "Em, don't you have somewhere better to be right now?" "Sophie," I said, "I need you to leave the party without drawing attention to yourself. I need you to walk to the back parking lot. I need you to not ask me anything until you get here." There was a beat of silence in which I heard Sophie's breathing change. Sophie is one of those people who understands tone the way musicians understand pitch. Instantly, completely, without needing it explained. She said, "Okay, 5 minutes," and hung up. She was there in 4. She came around the corner of the building and saw me standing against the wall in jeans and a sweatshirt and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and her face did a series of things in rapid succession. Confusion, alarm, and then a cold, focused clarity that I have always loved her for. She didn't ask what happened. She took one look at me and said, "You're shaking. Come on. My car is in the front lot. We'll walk around the outside." We walked around the outside in the dark. When we reached her car, she started the engine and turned on the heat and looked at me and said, "Talk." I talked. I told her everything Robert had said, everything I had seen over the past 18 months that I had not let myself see clearly, everything I understood now that I had not understood before. I talked for 20 minutes without stopping, and Sophie listened without interrupting, which is an extraordinary act of self-restraint for Sophie, who has an opinion about everything and usually cannot contain it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The storage unit. Can we go tonight? It's 11:30. Does it have a code lock or a key? I checked the paper from the bag. There was a 4-digit code written below the address in Robert's neat, careful handwriting. Sophie looked at it, then put the car in gear. "Then we're going tonight," she said. The storage facility was 20 minutes from the venue, in an industrial area near the edge of town. It was the kind of place designed for exactly this sort of thing. Anonymous and accessible at all hours with a keypad at the gate and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the night air. Robert's unit was near the back. I punched in the code and the padlock released, and Sophie held up her phone for light while I opened the door. Inside was a banker's box on a metal shelf and nothing else. I lifted the box down and opened it. Sophie held the light steady, and we looked at what Robert had assembled over 3 months of quiet, terrified preparation. There were photocopies of emails printed from Patricia's personal account, which Robert had apparently accessed on her laptop on occasions when she was asleep or out of the house. There were 2 draft documents, one a power of attorney that purported to bear my signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses, and one a deed transfer form from my grandmother's house, made out to Patricia Hale and signed with my name in handwriting that was close to mine but not quite mine, the slight stiffness of a copy rather than the original. There was a text exchange, photographed on Robert's phone and printed, Patricia and Victor, discussing the timeline. She signed Saturday night. Victor's guy takes it to the office Monday morning, should be processed by end of week, and Patricia's reply, "What about if she refuses?" And Victor's reply, which I read twice to make sure I was reading it correctly, "She won't have the option to refuse." There was also a folder containing printed records of Victor's criminal history, 2 prior convictions for fraud, 1 for assault, one that had been pleaded down from something more serious. Robert had obtained these from public court records and printed them with the obsessive thoroughness of someone building a case against people he was afraid of and could not bring himself to confront directly. There was a sticky note on the folder in his handwriting. "For the police. Emma, I'm sorry. I should have done this sooner." Sophie photographed every document on her phone before we repacked the box. We sat in her car in the parking lot of the storage facility with the engine running and the heat on, and I held the banker's box on my lap and looked at the text exchange on Sophie's phone screen. "She won't have the option to refuse," and felt the ice water clarity that comes after the shaking stops, after the adrenaline begins to metabolize, after your body realizes it is safe for now and passes the controls back to your brain. "We need a lawyer," Sophie said. "In the morning," I said. "First thing." "First thing," I agreed. "And tonight?" I thought about it. I thought about Daniel at the hotel, delivering me into a room where his mother's brother and 2 unnamed men were waiting with forged documents, and whatever they intended to do if I refused to sign them. I thought about his face when he said goodbye to me in the corridor, the smile I had loved, the eyes that had been warm. I tried to find the lie in it and could not locate it cleanly, because the most disturbing thing about people who deceive you is that the affection and the deception can coexist. He might have loved me and still done this. People are fully capable of that particular kind of cruelty. "Tonight," I said, "I am not going back." Sophie's apartment was 20 minutes away, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with a deadbolt on the front door, and a neighbor who was a retired police officer and who Sophie knew well enough to trust. We let ourselves in, and Sophie made tea with the same mechanical efficiency she brings to every crisis, and I sat at her kitchen table with the banker's box and my phone and tried to think clearly. My phone showed a missed call from Daniel, then another, then a text. "Emma, where are you? Come up, we're waiting." Then, 3 minutes later, "Em?" Then, after a pause of approximately 15 minutes that I imagined was spent dealing with Victor's impatience, "Emma, please call me. I can explain everything. I can explain everything." I looked at those words for a long time. I thought about all the things he might mean by them, and all the things he could not possibly mean anything other than what they were. I did not reply. I turned the phone off. Sophie came with the tea and sat across from me, and we went through the banker's box again, more carefully this time, organizing the documents into categories. What was evidence of fraud? What was evidence of criminal intent? What established the premeditated nature of the scheme? Sophie was a paralegal. I had known this, had been grateful for it in a general way, and had never been so acutely grateful for it as I was at 12:30 in the morning at her kitchen table. She handled the documents with professional attention, noting what would and would not be legally useful, flagging the items Robert had clearly prioritized. She was good at this. I was deeply, overwhelmingly relieved not to be alone. At one point, somewhere after 1 in the morning, I went into Sophie's bathroom and took off my grandmother's pearl earrings and set them on the counter and looked at them for a moment. I had been wearing them since 2 o'clock that afternoon. They had been present for the ceremony and the vows and the first dance and the escape down the fire exit and 20 minutes in a car in a storage unit in an industrial park at midnight. They were smaller than I remembered them being when I was a child, watching my grandmother wear them. She had seemed so immovable then, so permanently and incomprehensibly herself, so unable to be diminished or displaced. I had thought that was just something that happened to you as you got older, that you became solid in yourself in that way. I understood now that she had earned it, that she had fought for it in whatever ways the quiet fights of her generation had required, that the note she left me was not just sentiment but instruction, distilled from experience. Don't let anyone take it from you. I washed my face and went back to the kitchen. At 9 the next morning, Sophie called a lawyer she knew through her paralegal work, a woman named Margot Ellison who handled civil fraud cases and had a reputation for being precise and unfrightened. We met her at her office at 10:30, still in yesterday's clothes, with the banker's box and Sophie's photographs and everything Robert had assembled. Margot was in her mid-40s with dark hair cut severely and reading glasses she wore on the end of her nose. She went through the documents without expression, making notes on a yellow legal pad in a small, methodical hand. She asked questions in the same tone, factual, non-alarmed, focused. When she finished, she set down her pen and looked at me over her glasses. "The forged power of attorney alone is a felony," she said. "Given Victor's criminal record and the documented coordination between him and your mother-in-law, we are looking at conspiracy to commit fraud, potentially coercion depending on what they intended to do with those two unidentified men. The fact that your father-in-law prepared this documentation over 3 months and preserved it gives us an unusually clean evidentiary record." She paused. "The question is whether you want to pursue criminal charges, civil remedies, or both." "Both," I said without hesitation. Margot almost smiled. "Good," she said. "I'll file for an emergency injunction on the property transfer first thing. That stops any attempt to process those documents regardless of what happens in the short term. Then we take everything to the police." She picked up her pen again. "Do you know where your father-in-law is now?" I did not. I had not called Robert. I had spent the night unsure whether to contact him, grateful for what he had done, uncertain of his stability, unwilling to risk tipping off Patricia by having him behave differently than expected. Margot said she would need his cooperation as a witness. I said I would reach out through a channel that Patricia wouldn't be monitoring and spent the next 10 minutes figuring out what that meant. Eventually, I sent a message through a mutual Facebook acquaintance, a cousin of Daniel's who I knew Robert liked and who had no particular loyalty to Patricia, asking Robert to call Sophie's number when he had a moment in private. He called within 2 hours. His voice was very quiet. He said he had told Patricia that morning that he had been with Emma the night before, that he had warned me, and that he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said Patricia had screamed at him for 45 minutes and that Victor had called twice and that Daniel had not spoken to him. He said he was sitting in his car in a parking lot and that he was afraid but that he was not going back. I told him about Margot Ellison and gave him the address. He said he would be there in an hour. He was there in 40 minutes. The injunction was filed by 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon. The police report was filed Monday morning when Sophie drove me to the precinct with the banker's box and Margot's written summary of the evidence. The detective who took the report was a compact woman in her 50s, with a skeptical, seen-everything manner that shifted perceptibly when she went through the documents, particularly the text exchange and the forged power of attorney with its telltale imprecision, the signature almost right but not quite, the kind of forgery that passes a quick glance but fails close examination. She said she would be in touch. She was in touch by Wednesday. Daniel called 17 times in the 3 days between Sunday and Wednesday. I did not answer any of them. On Tuesday evening, I let one go to voicemail and listened to it alone in Sophie's spare room, with the phone pressed hard against my ear. He was crying. His voice had the particular fractured quality of someone who has had several sleepless nights and cannot stop replaying their own choices. He said he had not known about the men, about the coercion, about the plan to force me rather than persuade me. He said he had thought it was just going to be a conversation, that his mother and uncle were going to present me with paperwork and that I would understand, once it was explained, that this was the most practical arrangement. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He said he knew those words meant nothing right now and that he understood if they never meant anything again, but that they were true. I played the message twice. I sat with it. I tried to find in his fractured voice the answer to the question I kept returning to. Did it matter? The difference between what he intended and what Victor intended, if the outcome for me was the same, if I had been in that room, with those men, with those documents, would the distinction between persuasion and coercion have remained academic? If I had signed, had been intimidated into signing, would Daniel have stopped it? Would he have tried? I did not have clear answers. What I had instead was a cold, thorough understanding of what I needed to do next. On Thursday, I went back to the hotel venue to retrieve my wedding dress. I called ahead, and the manager, a sympathetic woman named Karen, who had gotten wind of the situation through the small, permeable membrane of local professional gossip, had it cleaned and boxed for me. I drove there alone in my own car. Sophie had returned mine from the venue parking lot on Sunday, and picked it up at the front desk and put it in the back seat. I drove home to my grandmother's house. I had not been there since the morning of the wedding, when Sophie and I had gotten ready in the kitchen and she had done my buttons, and the light had been golden through the windows, and everything had felt improbably and briefly perfect. I let myself in and stood in the hallway and breathed. The house smelled like lavender and old paperbacks, exactly as it always had. The sweet peas were still blooming against the back fence. I could see them through the kitchen window, pale pink and white in the September afternoon. The kitchen table was exactly as I had left it. A coffee mug on a saucer, a book I had been reading, an unopened piece of mail. I sat down at the table and put my hands flat on the pine surface and sat there for a long time, doing nothing except being in the house, letting the house be what it was, mine, undamaged, undiminished, still and solid and entirely itself despite everything that had been planned against it. I thought about my grandmother making tea at this table and reading at this table and deciding at some point in her long life that this partict, I sat down at the table and put my hands flat on the pine surface and sat there for a long time, doing nothing except being in the house, letting the house be what it was, mine, undamaged, undiminished, still and solid, and entirely itself, despite everything that had been planned against it. I thought about my grandmother making tea at this table and reading at this table and deciding, at some point in her long life, that this particular house, this scarred old place with its creaking floors and sun-faded curtains, was where she would root herself, where she would pour out her days like water from a jug, steady and unhurried. The weight of that choice settled over me now, heavier than the dust motes drifting in the slanted light. Gran had outlived 2 husbands, buried a child, watched wars come and go like seasons, and still she'd chosen this. Not out of stubbornness, I think, but something quieter, a fierce, unspoken loyalty to the ordinary, to the mug she could set down without fear of it shattering, to the garden that bloomed no matter how she'd neglected it some years. I traced a finger along a knot in the wood, feeling the familiar dip and rise, and wondered if I had that in me. Sophie had always said I didn't, that I was built for motion, for cities and reinvention, not for tending the same patch of earth until it became a part of you. Outside, a car passed slowly on the lane, tires crunching gravel, and I tensed without meaning to. The divorce papers had come yesterday, slipped through the letterbox like a coward's note, and with them the real estate agent's card. Pristine, insistent. "Let's turn this into an asset," it read in jaunty font, as if Gran's life could be distilled to square footage and curb appeal, as if mine could. I stood abruptly, chair scraping back, and moved to the sink. The unopened mail stared up at me. A utilities bill, a seed catalog she'd ordered before the fall. I tore it open anyway, scattering packets of lupins and foxgloves across the counter. Grand spidery handwriting on the address label. E. Hargrove, Willow Cottage, the garden called then, insistent as a pulse. I grabbed the secateurs from their hook by the door, the ones with the worn wooden handles she swore by, and stepped out. The sweet peas tangled wildly, overgrown since summer, their vines clutching the fence like desperate fingers. I began snipping, methodically at first, then faster, letting the rhythm take over. Petals fluttered to the ground in soft pink drifts, and the air filled with their faint honey scent, mingling with the earthier tang of turned soil. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool afternoon. My shirt clung damply. For the first time in months, my hands felt useful. By dusk, the fence ran straight again, the blooms pruned back to neat cascades. I straightened, back aching pleasantly, and surveyed it all. The house glowing warm against the twilight, windows catching the last light like eyes half-closed in contentment. A fox barked sharply from the woods beyond, and somewhere inside, the kettle I'd absent-mindedly set on before going out began to whistle, a thin, insistent cry. I went back in, poured the steaming water over a tea bag in Gran's favorite chipped pot, and sat once more. The mail could wait. The agent could wait. For tonight, at least, this was enough. The steam curling up, the house breathing around me, and the quiet certainty that some things, some lives, were worth holding on to, not by stubborn knot. The steam from the teapot curled upward like a question mark, dissolving into the dimming kitchen light. I sipped the tea, too hot, scalding my tongue just enough to ground me in the moment, and watched the shadows lengthen across the floorboards. Gran's house had always had this quality, a kind of patient endurance, as if it knew secrets about time that people didn't. Outside, the fox barked again, sharper this time, answered by a rustle in the underbrush. I set the cup down and listened. Not fear, exactly, but a prickle of awareness. The world beyond the garden felt vast and indifferent tonight. I didn't sleep well. Dreams came in fragments. Sophie's laughter echoing from the wedding morning, overlaid with the agent's voice droning about market value, Gran's hands gnarled but steady, kneading dough on this very table, and beneath it all, the house itself, creaking, settling, whispering that I belonged here more than I wanted to admit. I woke before dawn to rain pattering against the panes, the kind of soft English drizzle that turned lanes to mud and made everything smell of wet earth and renewal. Coffee first, black and strong, from the old percolator Gran swore by. No fancy machines for her. I pulled on wellies and the wax jacket from the hook by the door, hers too big in the shoulders but smelling faintly of her lavender sachets, and headed out to the shed. Tools waited in orderly rows, spade, fork, trowel, all worn smooth from decades of use. The seed packets from yesterday called to me. Lupins for height, foxgloves for drama. Why not? The garden had been her joy, her therapy after Granddad died. If I was staying, even for a week, a month, I'd honor that. The soil was heavy, clay-rich, but it yielded under the spade. I turned it methodically, row by row, the rain soaking through my shirt until I stopped feeling the cold. A robin hopped nearby, unperturbed, tugging worms from the turned earth. Hours passed unmarked. By noon, I'd cleared a bed the length of the fence and planted the first seeds, pressing them into the mud with careful fingers. My back screamed, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from making something real. That's when I heard the car, gravel crunching, slower than yesterday's passerby. A sleek SUV, city-bred, pulled up to the gate. Out stepped a woman in her 50s, tailored coat, pearls, hair swept into a chignon. She carried a clipboard like a shield. Elizabeth Hargrove? Her voice was crisp, Midland's accent polished smooth. I straightened, wiping mud from my hands. Yes? Miranda Fairfax. from Hargrove and Sons. She glanced at the house, then the garden, lips pursing slightly. Your grandmother's solicitor mentioned you'd be here, about the property. Of course, Gran's will had been straightforward. The house to me, her only grandchild, with a clause about responsible stewardship. No sale without family consultation, but Miranda looked like the type who turned clauses into loopholes. I know why you're here, I said, forcing calm, but I'm not selling. She smiled, practiced, and sympathetic. Perfectly understandable. Grief makes these decisions hard. But let's talk figures. This place, charming, yes, but dated. Roof needs work. Wiring's pre-war. We've got interest from developers. Quick cash, no fuss. I thought of Gran deciding, right here at this table, to stay. No. Miranda didn't flinch. Think practically, Elizabeth. Your life is in London. Career, friends. Soph, don't. The name stung like gravel in a cut. She raised a hand. Apologies. But properties like this, they drain you. Taxes, maintenance. Let us handle it. Rain dripped from my hood. The robin sang from the apple tree. Gran built her life here. I'm not draining anything, I'm starting. Miranda's eyes flicked to the muddy beds, the secateurs in my pocket. Romantic, but romance doesn't pay bills. She handed me a card. Sleep on it, call me. The SUV splashed away, leaving ruts in the drive. I crumpled the card, but didn't throw it. Not yet. Lunch was bread and cheese, eaten standing at the sink. The afternoon brought villagers, first tentative, then curious. Mrs. Ellis from the post office, dropping off mail with gossip about Sophie's new beau in the city. Old Tom from the farm up the lane, offering spare timber for the fence. Even the fox seemed bolder, darting across the lawn at twilight. By evening, exhaustion hit like a wave. I bathed in the claw-foot tub, water turning silty brown, and crawled into Gran's bed. The quilt smelled of her, lavender and wool, and for the first time since the funeral, sleep came deep and dreamless. Days blurred into a rhythm. Mornings, garden work. Afternoons, house tasks. The sink dripped. I fixed it with washers from the shed. A gutter leaked. I climbed the ladder, wobbling, cursing, and sealed it with Gran's ancient tube of mastic. Villagers trickled in, offers of help, stories of Gran's kindness. She brought me soup when my bill passed, said Mrs. Ellis, taught my girl to knit. One afternoon, as I wrestled with the overgrown laurel hedge, a van rumbled up. Out stepped a man in overalls, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a toolbox that clanked like promise. "Jack Warrender," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Heard you might need a sparky. Tom's my dad. He mentioned the wiring." I hesitated. Miranda's words echoed, dated, dangerous. "Come in," I said. Jack assessed the fuse box with a whistle. Bakelite. "Original. It'll do for lights, but cooker, no chance." He worked methodically, quoting fair prices. No pressure. By dusk, the kitchen glowed steadily. No flickering, no hum. "You're a lifesaver," I said, offering tea. He grinned, wiping hands on a rag. Gran was salt of the earth. Least I can do. As he left, Sophie texted, "Heard you're playing house. Sell it, Liz. Move on. Delete." No reply. Weeks turned the garden from mud to miracle. Lupin shoots speared green, foxgloves unfurled bells of purple and white. Sweet peas climbed anew, perfuming the air. I planted potatoes from Old Tom's slips, carrots, beans, basics, but mine. The house responded, floors sanded, with Jack's help. Curtains washed, windows polished until they gleamed, but cracks appeared. Bills piled, rates electric, higher now with Jack's upgrades. A solicitor's letter arrived, Sophie's, probing inheritance shares. Joint asset, it claimed. Gran had been clear, but lawyers twisted words. Worse, the dreams returned. Not Gran's piece, but Sophie's wedding morning. Golden light, her fingers on my buttons, promises we broke. I'd wake sweating, the house too quiet. One stormy night, thunder rattling panes, I found Gran's letters in the attic. Bundles tied with ribbon, addressed to a sister in Canada. Stories of Granddad's war, child's first steps, mine, small triumphs. One yellowed, decided to stay. This house holds us, always will. Rain lashed the roof. I wrote back, to no one, on her stationery. I'm trying, Gran, but it's heavy. Morning brought Jack unannounced with timber for shelves. Saw the drive's a mess. Gravel delivery? I laughed. First real one in weeks. Sure. We worked side by side, him sawing, me sanding. Talk flowed easy. His divorce 2 years back, kids in uni, love for restoring old bikes. Houses are like that, he said, fitting a bracket. Fix one bit, another shows, but worth it. By noon, shelves lined the kitchen, space for books, seeds, that damned agent's card, still there. That evening, Sophie arrived unannounced, city coat dripping, heels sinking in mud. This is madness, Liz. You're throwing your life away. I stood firm, spade in hand. My life was thrown. This is picking it up. She eyed the garden, the glowing windows, Jack's van in the drive. With the handyman, Gran would laugh. Gran stayed, I said, through worse. Sophie's eyes hardened. Call Miranda. Sign. No. She left in a spray of gravel, but slower this time. Fall deepened. Leaves turned gold, then fell. Harvest. Potatoes nobbled and sweet, carrots crisp. Jack came often, help turning into habit. Dinners, stew from garden veg, stories by the fire, chimney swept, his doing. One night, stars sharp overhead, we walked the lane. His hand brushed mine, warm, real. You're blooming here, he said. Fox barked agreement. Winter whispered in, frost rhyming the panes, breath fogging mornings. I knitted, badly with Gran's wool, mending curtains. Bills paid from savings, thin but enough. Sophie's texts stopped. Christmas, Jack and the villagers, turkey from Tom's farm, pudding aflame, laughter filled rooms silent too long. New Year dawned crisp. I stood at the table, hands on pine, Gran's letters beside seed catalogs. The house breathed, mine tended, alive. Miranda called. Offer doubled. Tell them no, I said. This isn't for sale. Decision made, like Gran's, rooted, steady. The fox trotted past the window, unhurried. Sweet peas slept underground, waiting for spring. And in the quiet, I felt it. The jug pouring out day by unhurried day. But life, as Gran knew, doesn't pause. Spring brought shoots, and Sophie's lawyer. A claim, undue influence. Gran incompetent at signing. Court date set. Jack stayed close. Fight it. I did. Papers flew. Gran's lucid will, witnesses, Mrs. Ellis, Tom. Garden as proof, thriving like her choice. Summer sweltered. Hearing, stuffy room, Sophie's glare. Judge reviewed, clear intent. Case dismissed. Sophie stormed out. Final text. You're as stubborn as her. Good luck. Relief flooded. Party at the house. Villagers, Jack's kids, lanky teens, charming. Foxgloves towered, lupins blazed blue. Fall again. Jack proposed under sweet peas, ring simple gold. Build with me? Yes, winter. Wedding small, kitchen table, golden light. His fingers did my buttons. The house watched, solid, undamaged, years layered children, 2 red-haired like him, laughter echoing Gran's. Garden expanded, play area, greenhouse, Jack's build. One morning, toddler tugging my hand. Grand table. I knelt. Yes, hers, ours. Fox's descendants yipped from woods. Evening, hands flat on pine. Perfect, improbably, entirely itself.